I was standing in line at the grocery store last week, behind a guy who looked to be in his late 30s. He was staring at his phone, scrolling through some article with a headline about a weaponized Justice Department and the enemy within. He seemed agitated, nodding to himself. Then it was his turn. He pushed his cart forward. A small pack of chicken breasts, a bag of rice, some frozen vegetables, and a six-pack of beer. The cashier rang it all up. The total came to $48.50. The guy looked up from his phone, and the political agitation just vanished. It was replaced by this look of flat, tired surprise. He glanced at the chicken, then at the screen, then back at the chicken, as if trying to solve a math problem that didn't make sense. He paid, shook his head, and left. On the store's little TV screen by the exit, a pundit was shouting about culture war maximalism. But the guy with the $48 bag of basics wasn't listening. He was already outside, and he just looked defeated. It made me wonder, what are we really paying attention to? While the entire media apparatus was fixated on the spectacle, the raids, the rhetoric, the grand theories of power, what if the real story, the one was actually deciding our future, was happening silently in that checkout line?
That story, wow, it really hits home, doesn't it? It just perfectly captures that gap between, the political noise and what people are actually dealing with day to day.
Exactly. That look on his face.
Yeah, that moment of shock when he saw the total, that $50 for just a few basics, that wasn't just like a random bad day at the store. It was almost inevitable, the end result of some very specific high-level decisions and strategies.
Okay, so that's what we're digging into today.
Absolutely. We're taking a deep dive into those, let's call them silent forces, the policies themselves, those really aggressive trade tariffs, and maybe more importantly, the sort of governing philosophy behind it all that led straight to that shock, that feeling you saw at the grocery store.
So the mission is to connect the dots.
Yeah.
How decisions in D.C. end up hitting your wallet at the checkout.
Precisely. How high-level strategy translates into that unexpected, persistent extra cost in your shopping cart.
All right, let's get into it. We're moving past the headlines straight to the grocery receipt, essentially. If the checkout line is where it hits home, let's start by looking at just how widespread the stress actually is.
Yeah, and we have some pretty stark numbers on that. There was an AP NRC poll, I think it was August 2025. The results were frankly startling. Nearly 90% of Americans, that's 9 out of 10 people, reported being stressed about the cost of groceries.
90%. That's practically everybody. You almost never see numbers like that in polling.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a little bit stress, right? You mentioned it was significant.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just background noise. The poll specifically asked about the level of stress, and over half, 53%, called food prices a major source of stress.
Wow.
And here's the kicker. It wasn't just a worry, it was the top financial concern. It beat out everything else.
More than housing, more than debt.
Yeah.
Because usually those are the big ones people worry about.
Exactly. Food prices at 53%. That significantly tops stress over housing costs, rent or mortgage payments, which was at 47%. And it was way ahead of worries about savings. That was 43%. Credit card debt at 29%. Even childcare, which we know is incredibly expensive, only 18% called that a major stressor.
So food prices are number one. That really says something about what feels most immediate, most painful to people right now.
It does, and I think it connects back to your story, to that lived experience. Housing is often the biggest single bill, sure, but you pay it once a month, maybe twice.
Groceries are different.
Groceries, you're facing that cost multiple times a week, maybe. It's constant, it's visible. Every trip is like taking your financial temperature.
It's a constant reminder, like a feedback loop of stress.
That's exactly it. It's this recurring, unavoidable confrontation with rising costs. So even if housing is technically a bigger chunk of the budget on paper, the salience of food prices, how much you notice it and feel it, is just way higher. It chips away at that feeling of basic security.
Okay, so people are feeling this intense, frequent pain point. What was the big policy lever being pulled around mid-2025 that was pushing these costs up so sharply?
Well, a major driver that researchers pointed to was the shock from the new tariff structure rolled out in 2025. Yale's budget lab, they ran the numbers, and their estimate was that these new tariffs alone would push overall food costs up by an additional 3%.
An extra 3%.
Yeah, and remember, that's 3% on top of the inflation that had already been building up for a couple of years.
Right. And 3% overall might sound small, but I guess it doesn't hit evenly. It probably lands hardest on certain staples, like the chicken and rice in that guy's cart from your story. What were the projections for specific food categories?
That's where it gets really noticeable. The jumps for some key things were pretty big, especially for stuff where we can't just easily switch to a domestic source. Fresh produce, for example, the initial projection was a nearly 7% jump right away.
7% on fruits and vegetables. Ouch.
Yeah, and long term, it was expected to settle about 3.6% higher than before the tariffs. That hits the weekly budget immediately, especially if you're trying to eat healthy.
Definitely. What about something like rice?
Processed rice. That was even more dramatic. The long-term projection there was a rise of, get this, 10.2%.
Over 10%. Why so high?
Well, basically, the U.S. doesn't produce nearly enough rice to meet demand, so we rely heavily on imports. Slap a big tariff on those imports, and the price has nowhere to go but up. And it wasn't just rice. We saw projections for increases in beverages, cereals, grains, sugar, meat, dairy, pretty much across the board as companies started factoring in these new costs.
So that explains the $48 for chicken, rice, and veggies. Those specific items were getting hammered by these projected increases. And this wasn't just theoretical, right? Companies weren't just absorbing these costs.
Not for long. Initially, maybe they tried, hoping the tariffs would be temporary, maybe get reversed or exemptions would come through. But reports from late summer 2025 were pretty clear. Companies were running out of room to absorb it.
Especially in groceries, right? Margins are famously thin.
Razor thin. Often just pennies on the dollar. So the evidence started piling up that they were beginning to pass these tariff costs directly onto consumers, pretty aggressively. The buffer period was over. That consumer pinch, it was becoming unavoidable.
Okay, so the shockwave hit the shopping cart. Let's trace it back to the source. What exactly did this 2025 tariff policy look like? It wasn't just targeted, was it?
No, not at all. What rolled out in early 2025 wasn't like a surgical strike on one or two products. It was broad, comprehensive, and pretty aggressive. It created this huge system-wide shock to trade, affecting almost everything coming into the country.
Can you break down the structure? What were the main rates people were suddenly dealing with?
Okay, so the baseline, implemented around April 2025, was a minimum 10% tariff on goods coming from most countries. This was framed as part of a strategy for, trade reciprocity.
A 10% floor on almost everything imported.
Pretty much, but then it got much steeper for specific major trading partners.
Like China.
Right. All Chinese imports got hit with a 20% tariff. And that itself was an increase from an initial 10% rate they'd set back in February. So if you were sourcing anything from China, suddenly you're looking at a minimum 20% tax just to get it into the U.S.
20% is huge. What about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico? They're crucial for food supply under USMCA. Were they exempt?
Mostly, but not entirely. There was a new 25% tariff specifically on goods from Canada and Mexico that weren't compliant with USMCA rules. Now, most trade was compliant, but this created uncertainty. Plus, there was that 10% tariff put on certain Canadian energy resources. It just immediately created these supply headaches and cost ripples that spread fast.
So you've got this baseline tax plus specific higher rates. It basically meant every single business relying on global sourcing, which is almost everyone these days, had their entire cost structure thrown into chaos overnight.
Chaos is a good word for it. And in the grocery world, it's particularly tough. Think about all the imported food items we rely on: fruits, vegetables, coffee, cocoa. They're really sensitive to these kinds of shocks, especially when there's no easy domestic substitute.
Can you give an example of that? Where we just can't switch easily.
Sure. Think about bananas or pineapples. Or even certain kinds of seafood. We just don't have the climate or the scale in the U.S. to suddenly start producing enough bananas to replace imports.
Yeah.
So if you slap a 20% or 25% tariff on bananas from, say, Central America, what happens? The importer has to pay it. There's no domestic banana farm to switch to, and ultimately the consumer pays it if they still want bananas. It acts almost like a direct tax on that specific food.
Okay, so that's the direct price impact. But there was another layer to this, right? Something about the volatility of the policy. An MSU study highlighted this.
Yes, that's a really crucial point. It wasn't just the level of the tariffs, it was how erratically they were managed. The Michigan State study found the 2025 tariff actions were uniquely volatile. Meaning they were announced, sometimes partially reversed, then maybe reinstated or changed, often with very little warning. 1 month a product might be tariff-free, the next it has 20%. This kind of whiplash makes planning, especially supply chain planning, which needs stability over like 12, 18 months, almost impossible. The uncertainty itself becomes a huge cost.
The cost of uncertainty. How does that work? It's not just the tariff itself, but the risk of the tariff changing. The MSU researchers had a framework for this, didn't they? 3 types of costs?
That's right. They broke it down into 3 distinct layers of costs that businesses face when dealing with this kind of policy whiplash.
Okay, let's walk through them. First up, adjustment costs. Sounds straightforward.
Adjustment costs. Yeah, these are the direct costs of actually changing what you do. So your supplier in China gets hit with that 20% tariff. Now you have to spend time and money finding a new supplier, maybe in Vietnam or Mexico. That means scouting trips, legal fees for new contracts, maybe retooling your factory line for slightly different parts, new quality checks. It all adds up.
Okay, makes sense. Second, transaction costs. More paperwork.
2, transaction costs. Pretty much, this is the cost of navigating the bureaucracy when the rules keep changing. More customs paperwork, trying to figure out complex rules of origin to see if the tariff even applies, hiring more lawyers and consultants, dedicating staff just to track what the tariff rate is this week. When the policy is a moving target, these admin costs explode.
Right. And the third one sounds the trickiest. Opportunity costs.
Yeah.
The cost of guessing wrong.
3, opportunity costs. Exactly. This is the big one tied to uncertainty. Imagine you're a huge importer. There's a threat of a massive new tariff. Do you act now? Do you spend, say, $50 million immediately shifting your entire supply chain out of the targeted country?
Okay.
Well, what if you do that and then a month later the government reverses the tariff or postpones it? That $50 million you spent adjusting is essentially wasted. But if you wait, hoping it blows over and the tariff does stick, now you're paying the full tax burden for months while you scramble to adjust, losing money and market share. It's this high-stakes guessing game.
That paralyzes planning. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. What did this look like in the real world for importers?
We heard descriptions of total planning paralysis. Major importers were saying they had like 5, sometimes 10 different contingency plans drawn up at the same time.
10 plans.
Yeah, because they just couldn't predict which version of the tariff policy would actually stick. Think of the resources wasted. You're paying teams to model 10 possible futures when you only live in one. It leads to higher inventory costs to buffer against shocks, sourcing nightmares, and ultimately, it all flows downhill to the consumer as higher prices and less availability. The system needs stability, and the policies seem designed to create instability.
Okay, so the instability starts high up, creates chaos in the supply chain, and lands on our plates. Now let's look at the big players, the giant grocery retailers. How did they respond? Did they just eat the costs, or did they push back?
Well, looking at the big 5, Walmart, Costco, Kroger, Albertsons, and Ahold Delhaize, the public message was pretty consistent across the board. Lots of warnings, complaints about the complications, the cost pressures from these new tariffs. They were definitely trying to manage public expectations about prices going up.
Let's start with the biggest, Walmart.
Yeah.
What were they saying? It wasn't just about prices. They also noticed changes in how people were shopping, right?
Yeah, Walmart CEO Doug McMillon was very direct. He basically said, look, these tariffs will mean higher prices. He stated flat out they couldn't just absorb all that pressure given how thin retail margins already are. It was a clear signal. This cost is coming your way, consumer.
And what were they seeing at the cash registers? Did their data back up that stress we talked about earlier?
It did. McMillon mentioned observing what he called stress behaviors. Shoppers were getting much more selective, really focusing on value, maybe trading down from national brands to store brands, just generally being more cautious with their spending. It confirmed that the stress showing up in polls was translating directly into buying decisions.
But here's where it gets complicated, isn't it? They're warning about tariff pain, but then you hear reports about their own performance.
Right, that's the apparent contradiction. While they're talking about pressure, there were reports, often fueled by social media, showing significant price hikes on some key grocery items, maybe 40% increases in some cases, which is way more than that baseline 3% tariff impact.
40%.
Yeah. And at the same time, Walmart was reporting that grocery sales were actually a major financial driver for them in early 2026. Sales were strong across dairy, pantry items, fresh foods.
So if sales volume and revenue are up, even with these cost pressures, how do we know the price hikes are just passing through the tariff cost? Couldn't it also be, well, taking advantage of the situation, using the tariff as cover to expand margins?
That's exactly the question critics were asking. They've got increased volume, maybe people are consolidating shopping trips at big stores like Walmart to find value, but they're also raising prices significantly. It suggests they might be using their market power. The tariffs become a convenient excuse, a sort of external justification for price increases that might go beyond just covering the new tax.
Interesting. Okay, let's look at Costco. They operate on super thin margins, huge volume. How did they handle it?
Costco was also very clear. Groceries are particularly vulnerable. Their CFO basically said, yeah, we're efficient, but we can't avoid this entirely. Food margins are very tight, so they have less wiggle room than other retailers.
And they actually reported seeing inflation specifically tied to the tariffs.
They did. They mentioned seeing tangible tariff inflation, especially on fresh stuff imported from Central and South America. And their response was, well, almost tactical.
Yeah, so?
They started monitoring key commodities, things like eggs, butter, olive oil, daily, if not hourly.
Hourly, wow.
Yeah, that level of intensity suggests they were actively playing the markets, trying to hedge against the price swings caused by all this trade uncertainty. It shows just how volatile things had become.
That's incredible. What about logistics? Did they change how they moved goods?
Definitely. They did things like pulling shipments forward, basically stocking up on inventory before the tariffs hit to avoid the tax. And more complex stuff, too, like rerouting goods. If something was coming from a country facing a really high tariff, say 25%, they might divert it to sell in their Canadian or European stores instead of the U.S. first.
So shifting the burden around globally still adds complexity and cost, though.
Absolutely. Now, Albertsons. They seem to take the most, let's say, assertive stance, particularly towards their own suppliers. This is where that market power issue really comes into focus.
What did they do?
Well, their CEO acknowledged they might eventually have to pass costs to customers. But the first step, their immediate reaction, was what they called a rigorous process of pushing back hard on suppliers. They basically saw suppliers as the first shock absorber.
Pushing back how? What was the message to suppliers?
There was some leaked info about this. Apparently, Albertsons told suppliers straight up, we are not accepting cost increases, period. And they set up this incredibly complicated, multi-step approval process for any supplier who even tried to request a price hike.
So basically daring suppliers to even ask and making it a bureaucratic nightmare if they did.
Exactly. It's using their leverage as one of the biggest grocery buyers in the country, and this got flagged by anti-monopoly watchers.
How did they frame it?
They described it as Albertsons wielding its market power like a cudgel. Think about it. Albertsons controls a massive amount of shelf space.
Yeah.
If you're a smaller regional producer of, say, pasta sauce, you probably can't afford to lose their business.
Right. So if that small supplier is suddenly paying a 20% tariff on imported tomatoes and Albertsons says, nope, no price increase for you, what happens to the supplier?
They're stuck. Option one, they eat the 20% cost increase themselves. For a small company, that could mean operating at a loss, maybe even going bankrupt eventually. Option two, they try to squeeze costs somewhere else, maybe cut corners on ingredients, maybe lay off workers, impacting quality or service. Option three, they try to raise prices on their other customers, the smaller stores, but that might not be enough volume to make up the difference.
And the net effect of this cudgel?
It accelerates consolidation. If the tariffs make it impossible for smaller or import-reliant suppliers to survive without raising prices, and the giants like Albertsons refuse those increases, who wins? The giants. The smaller guys fail, competition shrinks, and paradoxically, the consumer probably still ends up paying more in the long run because there's less choice and less pressure on the big retailers.
So the policy, maybe intended to help domestically, ends up strengthening the biggest players and squeezing out the smaller ones. That's a pretty damaging unintended consequence.
And we saw similar noises from the other big players, too. Kroger said they expected a smaller business impact, claiming they source more domestically. But even they admitted mid-single-digit effects on produce from Mexico and Canada and called price increases a last resort. They were also trying to control that narrative.
And Ahold Delhaize, they run Food Lion, Stop and Shop.
They also warned explicitly that tariffs could lead to price increases for American consumers, blaming geopolitical volatility. Their CEO said negotiations with suppliers were really tight because of tariffs and inflation combined. But interestingly, they also mentioned higher sales volumes, which suggests people were cooking at home more to save money.
So more customers, but still feeling the margin squeeze. It's the same pattern. Higher volume, maybe, but undeniable pressure leading to price hikes.
Exactly. The pressure was systemic.
Okay, so we've got the tariffs as the mechanism, and the corporate response pass it on or squeeze the supplier. Now we need to zoom out again. Look at the bigger political picture. The architecture that allowed or maybe even encouraged this kind of economic instability. It feels broader than just trade policy.
Right. This connects to a much broader governing strategy, one that seemed to favor disruption and executive action over stability and predictability. We're talking about governing by exception, and the framework for this was really laid out in that big policy agenda, Project 2025.
Okay, Project 2025, we hear that term a lot. Can you define it clearly? What is it, and how does it connect to this idea of a unitary executive?
Sure. Project 2025 is this massive, incredibly ambitious policy blueprint. It's like 900 pages long, put together by the Heritage Foundation and other conservative groups. Think of it as a detailed plan for reshaping the executive branch to dramatically increase presidential power. And it leaned heavily on this maximalist interpretation of the unitary executive theory.
The unitary executive theory. What does that actually mean in terms of how the government runs?
Well, in its most extreme form, it asserts that the president has total control over the entire executive branch. That means they can act, essentially, without the usual checks and balances from Congress or even the courts, especially when it comes to things like hiring, firing, and directing agency actions. Some legal experts say it basically amounts to a justification for the idea that the president can do whatever I want within the executive sphere.
That's a huge shift in power. It implies policy stability depends entirely on the president's decisions, not on established processes or laws.
Precisely. It's not just about changing policies, it's about changing how government works, fundamentally. And a key part of Project 2025's strategy for achieving this control is through personnel specifically overhauling the civil service.
Right, this is the Schedule F plan we heard about. Firing career officials.
Exactly. Schedule F is the mechanism. It's a plan to reclassify potentially tens of thousands of career civil servants people currently hired for their expertise, often with decades of experience, making them essentially political appointees who can be fired at will and replaced with people chosen primarily for political loyalty.
And this isn't just about random bureaucrats, right? They're targeting specific agencies that oversee critical parts of the economy and public safety.
Yes, the plan explicitly targets key regulatory bodies, agencies that traditionally operate with a degree of independence. Think about the FDA, which ensures food and drug safety, or the SEC, policing the financial markets, even the Justice Department.
So what happens if you take, say, a career scientist at the FDA who reviews drug safety data and replace him with someone whose main qualification is loyalty to the current administration? What's the immediate effect?
Chaos and loss of confidence. If the people making critical decisions about food safety or market stability or prosecuting fraud are chosen for political allegiance rather than expertise, the whole system becomes suspect. Businesses rely on predictable, rules-based regulation. If they can't trust the FDA's approvals or the SEC's enforcement to be impartial and competent, market volatility spikes. Investment might freeze up. Supply chains for essential goods like medicines could be disrupted. It fundamentally undermines trust in the system, and critics argue it's inherently corrupting.
So the stated goal might be dismantling the deep state, but the practical outcome is injecting massive uncertainty and instability into the very systems that keep the economy functioning. You called this weaponizing stability.
Yeah, it feels like a deliberate strategy of ruling by exception and not by law. It creates this environment of constant crisis, of executive orders overriding established norms. And that erosion of basic predictability is something people and businesses really depend on. When that goes, things start to break down.
And we saw this play out very directly during those government shutdown fights, didn't we? Where basic benefits, things people rely on to buy groceries, were explicitly put on the chopping block.
Absolutely. That was a stark example. There were open discussions about using programs like SNMP, food stamps, and Medicaid as leverage in political negotiations. It wasn't subtle. It was discussed as a tactic.
Threatening people's ability to eat as a bargaining chip. The human cost of that kind of manufactured crisis must be immense.
It's terrifying. Imagine being a family relying on SNAP, suddenly hearing that your benefits might be cut off, not because of eligibility changes, but as part of a political power play in Washington. Agencies were scrambling to find emergency funds, contingency plans. It creates this profound uncertainty and anxiety for millions of families just trying to survive.
And the goal was explicitly to inflict pain.
The strategic thinking, as reported, was precisely that. To create maximum pressure on political opponents by threatening programs that they like, even if it meant causing direct harm to vulnerable citizens. We saw quotes surface talking about doing irreversible things during a shutdown, like cutting vast numbers of people out, cutting benefits, things related to medical care.
So the potential loss of SNA benefits, the money people use for groceries, was seen as leverage.
It was framed that way. It takes the anxiety from a personal level, can I afford this week's groceries, and elevates it to the systemic, uncontrollable fear. Will the government even function next month? Will my support disappear overnight? That manufactured instability just pours gasoline on the fire of the economic stress people are already feeling from inflation and tariffs. It suggests an administration may be less focused on cushioning the economic blows and more on, well, political maneuvering while people struggle.
It seems like that toxic combination policies, pushing costs up, and a governing style creating constant uncertainty, eventually had to reach a breaking point with voters. Which brings us to the election, where it seems the pantry finally outweighed the political spectacle. Let's shift to that electoral verdict.
Yeah, the post-election analysis, especially looking at data like the Gardner Food and Agricultural Policy Survey, or GFAPS, conducted right after the 2024 election, paints a really clear picture. Economic issues, specifically the cost of living, just dominated everything else.
What did that survey show for voters who backed the winner, the Trump campaign? What was their number one issue?
For Trump voters, it was overwhelmingly economic. Get this, over 60%, 60.8% cited either cost of living inflation at 33% or the economy more broadly at 27.8% as the single most important issue driving their vote.
Wow, that's a huge concentration on financial concerns. What about Harris voters? Was it more spread out for them, or did economics still lead?
It was definitely more spread out for Harris voters, reflecting maybe a wider range of concerns in that coalition. But cost of living inflation was still the single most common top issue for them at 22.6%. It was just followed more closely by things like candidates' values or fitness for office.
So even for the opposition voters, the squeeze was the top concrete issue.
Exactly. And interestingly, for people who didn't vote at all, economic frustration seemed key too. Nearly half of non-voters, 44.4%, said cost of living or the economy was the most important issue. It suggests economic pain wasn't just switching votes. It might have been depressing turnout, too.
So right across the board, voters for both sides, non-voters, money worries were front and center. This brings up that classic distinction in voting behavior, pocketbook versus sociotropic voting. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. It's basically the difference between voting based on your personal situation versus your perception of the country's situation. Sociotropic voting is when you vote based on how you think the national economy is doing. Maybe you read gloomy GDP reports, you think things are bad nationally, but maybe you personally are doing okay. A lifelong Democrat might still vote Democrat even if they think the national economy is weak because they trust their party more on the issue or their loyalty overrides that national concern.
Okay, that's the big picture view. What about pocketbook voting?
Pocketbook voting is much more personal, more visceral. It's when your own economic struggles, the inflation hitting your paycheck, making your groceries unaffordable directly influence your vote. The study found this was a much stronger force for changing votes. If you're feeling the pinch directly, you're far more likely to vote against the incumbent party, even if it's the party you usually support. Personal pain trumped party loyalty more often than just a negative view of the national economy.
That makes intuitive sense. That $48.50 grocery bill feels a lot more real than an abstract GDP number. And the data showed the grocery bill was the sharpest pain point, right?
Absolutely, unequivocally. First, Trump voters reported feeling much more affected by inflation overall. They rated the impact at 7.6 out of 10, compared to 6.1 for Harris voters.
Okay.
But then, when the survey drilled down into specific types of inflation, housing, gas, healthcare, groceries, which one hit hardest? Across the board, for all voters, it was groceries.
Groceries were number one for everyone.
The reported impact of grocery inflation was highest among Trump voters, a massive 7.9 out of 10. But it was also incredibly high for non-voters at 7.4. It just reinforces that point we made earlier. Even if housing costs more overall, the frequency and visibility of rising grocery prices made it the most potent source of financial frustration.
So this set up that promise versus pantry dynamic. The campaign promise was relief, specifically claiming grocery prices were falling.
Right. There were claims made about prices going down. But the reality, nearly a year into the new term, didn't match that rhetoric. Independent analyses looking at the actual food-at-home consumer price index showed grocery costs were still stubbornly higher than they'd been the year before the election. That claim about prices being down was widely fact-checked as, well, a stretch at best. There just wasn't sustained broad relief.
And the policies we've been discussing, the tariffs, maybe combined with other things like labor crackdowns in agriculture, were actively working against that promise of relief, right? They were keeping pressure on prices.
That's the direct link researchers made. The tariffs push up import costs, and retailers, as we saw, pass those costs on. At the same time, things like stricter enforcement impacting undocumented labor in agriculture, which is crucial for harvesting and processing, likely raised labor costs per unit.
The tariffs plus tighter labor supply in key sectors.
Exactly. That combination was flagged as a likely contributor to higher operating expenses for food producers and processors, which then translates to higher prices on the shelf. These policy choices, maybe amplified by other things like bad weather, actively prevented the kind of widespread price relief voters had been hoping for.
So what's the big takeaway from this election analysis? What does it tell us about what really motivates voters when times are tough?
The bottom line seems to be that voters ultimately punished the narratives that didn't match their lived reality. The election really confirmed that kitchen table economics, that fundamental daily struggle to afford the basics, perfectly symbolized by that ever-increasing grocery bill, simply outweighed the culture war maximalism that often dominates the headlines, the spectacle, the rhetoric. It just couldn't hold up against the undeniable reality people faced every time they went to buy food.
So we started this deep dive with that image of the guy in the grocery line, his political anger suddenly replaced by sticker shock over $48.50 for basics. And tracing it back, what we found is that moment wasn't random at all. It seems like it was the direct, almost predictable outcome of very specific economic policies, those aggressive tariffs, the labor shifts, but also amplified by this broader governing philosophy, this embrace of executive power that seemed to deliberately introduce instability and uncertainty into the whole system, from high finance right down to the supermarket aisle.
Absolutely. All the noise, all the spectacle and rhetoric that fills the news cycle, it really does seem to fade when it bumps up against the hard, recurring reality of rising prices for things you simply cannot live without. The really critical decisions about the country's direction, it seems they weren't ultimately being made in the cable news studios or on social media. They were happening much more quietly, but much more powerfully in that daily grinding struggle just to afford a cart full of essential groceries. That silence in the checkout line, that palpable stress, it seems to hold a lot more weight, a lot more enduring power than even the loudest political commentary.